questions.
Hi there. I was actually a national delegate for Obama in '08, so I know how your experience was probably a little different than that, but pretty good time and pretty powerful to be a part of, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a life-altering event meeting, especially because I got to meet so many state-level reps. So a lot of the people in Olympia that I can go bug now when I have issues, since I'll
Yeah.
actually be living right off Division. So
Oh wow, right on. Okay, over on the
I'll be
west
just
side.
down the street from Evergreen. I actually happen to be a greener. So those
Nice.
that's one of the biggest, one of the things I have to ask you about. So when I was a child, I lived in Thurston County for a little bit. I lived in Yelm when Yelm was a road and not much else. So I've seen the kind of population boom that's happened in Thurston County, and I also know that there's about at any given time, there's about 4,000 students attending the Evergreen State College, myself being one of them. How do you how do you make it a more friendly environment for college students? Because a lot of college students are falling well below the poverty line. It makes it much harder. It's hard to go to school as is and then find work when most of the jobs, especially in the area, are saying we need you 40 hours a week. Most of us are committing at least 16 hours a week to class, some committing even up to 20 hours. So this makes it, it's a drain really on some of the public assistance programs out there because college students are unable to stay afloat. And if college students, since most of us, I believe 75% of the student body at Evergreen is a state resident, such as myself, it perpetuates the cycle within the state of poverty where we attend college, we try to get the degree, we end up in a massive amount of debt, we're unable to work, and it suddenly falls apart and fizzles because there's a combination of jobs that are not friendly to college students. There's not a lot of affordable housing, especially for those who can only work 10 to 15 hours a week. The transit system is much better than it has been, but it also makes it harder for students who live somewhere like Centralia, who live way far south, who want to try to come up north to get to one of the best schools in Washington, which just happens to be in Thurston County. How are ways that we attack these issues? Because it doesn't just affect us as students, it affects families, low-income families. Many of us, we belong to one of those. So how would you make it a more inviting environment work-wise for students and people who are limited in their ability to work many hours a week?
Yeah, definitely. So it's actually a great question. On Monday, I was at the White House meeting with administrative staff from the Department of Education and from Obama's staff to talk about College Promise, which is their plan for 2 years of free community college for every American. And one of the things that was said is right now we're at a point in our society where 70% of all jobs require something after high school. And we're going to be at 90% very soon. And so how can we change our structures and make it so we're not emphasizing that 4-year degree as much and have more opportunities for 2-year degrees and technical schools that can generate an income faster and in some ways even better than a 4-year degree, depending on your interest levels. But locally, there's a lot we can do to help try to think about whether there's a way to have a local College Promise program. Like they have a privately funded College Promise program in Michigan, in Kalamazoo, and several places around the country that would be good opportunities for Thurston County to look at. We have an income tax on the ballot in November in Olympia that will pay for 2 years of free community college. I'm not supporting that, not because I don't think there needs to be a change in the taxes or because I don't think there needs to be that program, but it's not very well written, and I don't think it's the right kind of policy the way it was written this time, but it's a good idea. So we can look at those kind of opportunities. And then lastly, I think we have to do everything we can to bring the students into the community. So I know that our mayor and other elected officials, including myself, have talked to the president of Evergreen about having a presence in downtown and maybe creating a satellite campus in downtown so that we can have the students be more close to the resources, because there's actually kids living way out there that come into downtown to use the food bank while they go to school, and that's not okay with me. So that's a couple of ideas, but the root of that is really a lot more of a state or a federal issue.
Okay, and I can definitely understand that because it is a state college. One of the things that I do have a big question for you, and this is particularly poignant to me as a person of color moving to an area like Olympia. So, excuse me, I haven't had a chance to meet you and talk with you before, and some of our viewers won't know this as well. I was born in Seattle. I lived in the Central District in Seattle, a historically black neighborhood. I've grown up in Tacoma. I've grown up in large cities in Washington State, where there is a large population of people of color, and even here and now I live in University Place, a subsect of Tacoma, where we're dealing with intense police scrutiny, intense suspicion, intense fear, and a lot of times out and out racism, where a lot of us are afraid. We're routinely stopped when we call the police. I've had guns pulled on me by police officers after I've called them because my house was shot at. They pulled their weapon in an area where they're constantly surrounded by people of color in their daily life so long as they live in the city. Now, going down to a county like Thurston County, which is more representative of Washington as a whole, where there's not a very large population of people of color, I'm quite frankly worried about what my interactions with police are going to be like, especially since in the last year we've had 2 young men who were unarmed already shot with police. A man came from Aberdeen, I believe it was, and stabbed somebody because he thought there was black people who were writing hateful messages towards police, which I'm sure some of us probably did, but I don't think that warrants us being stabbed. So as a county commissioner, and you're going to be someone working hand in hand with law enforcement, how do you make those interactions less dangerous for all parties involved?
Yeah, boy, I just want to apologize for America that you have to deal with that as a person of color. It's pretty sick to me that we've gotten to this point in this country where we don't value our differences as the thing that makes our country great. And so that's hindsight. But looking forward, I think there's a lot of things we can do to bring our community together. And I'll tell you that while there are a few examples here, we're a lot more safe and in a lot better place, at least in the general urban area of Thurston County, than a lot of places that you might move in the United States. The thing for me is, and we've been working on this actually a lot longer than there was an officer involved shooting in Olympia. But the thing for me about this is really about flipping the culture of police and how we interact with our police in our community, and getting to a point where our police are actually examining their racial biases and are trained in that way. I've heard people say that police are trained, for weeks and weeks on how to use their weapons and guns, but very little time on how they think and how they interact and how they make decisions based on their own internal bias. And I have a lot of training in communication, and all of this comes down to communication and ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes to some extent, to try and understand where they're coming from. And I think we're getting to a point now where, while it might not feel this way to most people or look this way when you look at the TV, that most law enforcement are starting to get that and trying to figure out how to get their department through the culture shift to get there, because it takes one. And then along with that, we might look all white in Olympia, but we do have some great, wonderful leaders that are of color, and a good population of people of color. It's, while not a huge percentage of the community, it's a powerful percentage of the community. And so making sure that those folks are represented in our lawmaking and in our policing, and that's been really hard to do. And I've asked on camera the police chief a couple of times, how do we get people of color on the police department, and how do we change our hiring practices so we can do that? And unfortunately, I think sometimes we set up systems that we think are going to work for that, and they backfire on us, and we end up not having the people of color even apply so they can get the chance to be screened in a fair way. And a lot of that is because I think, I mentioned this, our differences are what make us great. And so for me, doesn't feel right to have the hiring practice be blind. So knowing what you're getting and who you're looking at up front may be a conversation that we have, versus a lot of these police hiring practices are blind, and they don't even know the race or color of the person until they get to a in-person interview. And while I don't want to bring more opportunity or option for prejudice, I do think there has to be some conversation about how to get to a point where it's easier to hire people of color and see them in the process as equals to people with equivalent training, education, and experience.
I definitely appreciate that answer. I appreciate the willingness to confront these problems head on. It's something we don't see quite often, frankly. in communities of color, there's oftentimes this level of "we'll do it yourself," or that pull yourself by your bootstraps mentality. And I appreciate that you are willing, as an elected official, to come to bat for all of your constituents. That's something I haven't seen throughout a lot of these races, and I really do appreciate that. I only have one more question for you, then I'll toss it over to Richard. It's we've talked about poverty, right? We've talked about poverty, especially as it pertains to a rural county like Thurston, where there is at one point at least there was nothing but farmland when I remember growing up there, and now we're starting to see some housing developments and some apartments. How do we make equitable income? Housing? How do we get affordable housing? What percentage of new apartments and buildings would you want to see marked off exclusively for low-income families, and how would you expand the transit system for poor people? Right now, I know that there's a program where you can ride for free to job interviews and things like that if you're a low-income person. Would you support expanding programs like that throughout the county and making it more accessible to those in the more rural areas?
Yeah, absolutely. I know the transit one comes down to money, unfortunately. And so I don't know if you were here still, but we don't have bus service in South County at all. We have what's called the Rural and Tribal Transit, which is a van that drives a fixed route 2 or 3 times a day into South County, but isn't nearly adequate for the kind of access to the community. And it's actually a huge barrier for the most poor people who tend to live further out in the rural areas. When it comes to affordable housing, I've been an advocate for us putting an affordable housing levy to the voters, so that we can create some tax dollars that will build affordable housing complexes. But stepping back from that a minute, I think my gut has always said, and I know they've been successful with this in Portland and a couple of other cities, that if you're going to build a housing complex of, say, 10 units as a good even example, that some percentage of those units should be low income or affordable housing. Some percentage of those units should be middle income or middle income housing, and then the remainder should be market rate. And that should essentially reflect the population. So if we're at 30% or 40% people who are in the Alice category in the city of Olympia, I would say 30 or 40% of all of the housing that is built needs to be affordable. In downtown Olympia, we were at a point where we had about 80% of our housing being affordable, or even now I lost the word, like Section 8, like low income government sustained housing. And then now we've had some bigger, more market rate housing developments come in, and all of our affordable housing is full. And it's that way in almost every town. And when you get out into places like Tenino or Yelm, there's very little affordable housing that's safe, so your family can, get by. Because there's a lot of affordable out there, but the safety factor or the location make it less than desirable. So I really think this is a place that government needs to get involved in a bigger way to force policies that say, if you're going to build more than one unit, you need to have some consideration or some requirement for different strata of housing in there. I don't think we're going to get enough without doing that.